It's a pleasure to be here. I'm one of those people who it's my first time in Madison, and everybody keeps texting me and asking if I've had any beer or any cheese yet. And so that combined with the view, I might stick around a while, Matt. I'm really excited to be here, and again, my name is Andrew Crane. I'm at the University of Georgia. I work in the graduate school now doing experiential learning for graduate students, but my background's in career services, and I'm a PhD student at the Institute of Higher Education at UGA. So this presentation is a study that was conducted for the NACE Foundation, the National Association of Colleges and Employers. And Matt, I'm sorry, there is a face. Florida ACE has taken that. But obviously NACE is invested in studying this topic, and so I'm looking forward to sharing these results with you, focusing specifically on unpaid internships. And apologies, I'll make sure the slides are available as well, because I know the visibility may be tough. But I just wanted to set the stage by, again, underlining, we've already heard this morning, why the focus on unpaid internships is so important. I know we'll be hearing from Ross Perlin later today, and I think he outlines this idea really well in his work, in his book, basically calling attention to the fact that certain fields really do have this kind of rich or nasty tradition, depending on how you want to look at it, of having a lot of unpaid internships as the pathway into the profession, a lot of exploitation in terms of the fact that those students are doing really valuable work and aren't getting compensated. And so it has become, of course, an issue that's drawn a lot of attention lately. At the same time, we know that a lot of students are pursuing those opportunities still. So this is data from a couple years ago from NACE showing at that time 65% of students they found were doing internships, and around 60% of those were paid, which if you do the math equates to roughly a third of internships being unpaid. So again, that's a really significant number, and we need to do a lot more to kind of understand and tease apart what students are getting from those experiences. And NACE has found that internships, as we might expect, tend to lead to job offers for many students. But as NACE began to collect data on this issue, one thing that they realized was, even though internships generally led to a lot of good outcomes for students, they started to see, the data pointed to some differences between paid and unpaid experiences. So again, as we've noticed in the media, these things may not be created equally. So this was the call for research that NACE put out in 2015, and the basis for this study. Basically looking at specifically unpaid internships and how those connect to certain outcomes. So at the University of Georgia, we have a pretty rich set of existing data, and this is kind of a multi-part study. We have pretty good response rates in terms of our career outcomes, first destination data, and we actually do an internship survey every year that I'll talk about a little bit more. So we had some existing data, and that was kind of part one of the study, and then I collected some additional study from alumni, basically kind of asking them to submit some of their high impact experiences that they had, including internships, and some qualitative interviews as well. So it's a multi-part study using existing and new data. I look at career outcomes in the study, and one thing I want to point out is NACE in their career outcomes rate counts part-time work as an outcome, and I just look at full-time. So when I report and talk about job placement, I'm looking at full-time employment. And one thing I want to point out is all the data from this study is drawn from the University of Georgia, which is a very traditional kind of place, traditional age students. We have very hyper-engaged students. A lot of them are doing multiple internships, sometimes at once. So my hunch is that a lot of these findings relate to other contexts, but I think, as Matt mentioned, there could be some real value in kind of replicating this analysis in other settings. So I'll briefly just mention some of the concepts that inform the study. If you do work on internships, you'll recognize a lot of these names. David Kolb, experiential learning, kind of really looking at from that process perspective of how students turn experience into real knowledge. Albert Bandura and his work on self-efficacy, which it relates a lot to how students can set and move toward goals, kind of career management, and super self-concept, kind of that self-identity formation. Internships inform a lot of these, and these concepts will show up as you see in the analysis. So I'm just going to walk through each portion of the study here bit by bit and kind of what came out in each section. As I mentioned, the first part of the analysis focused on existing data. So I looked over the course of a couple years. This is fall 2010 to 2014. And again, found that about a third of the students who were reporting internships were reporting unpaid experiences. So we have each fall, when we do this internship survey, about 3,000 student respondents. We offer them football tickets, so that's always a big draw. But one thing that really piqued my curiosity was the students who were reporting these experiences. About 85% of the students who did unpaid internships were saying that their experience was highly beneficial or extremely beneficial, kind of those top two ratings on a 5-point Likert scale. And I thought that was kind of interesting because at the same time we're hearing a lot of this negative information about unpaid internships. So this is basically what I wanted to dive in a little bit more throughout the rest of the study. I looked at, in this initial phase, just the students who did an internship prior to graduating, that summer prior, with the assumption that that's kind of like the pinnacle experience that they're going to have for many students. So as other presenters have mentioned, some differences in terms of who participates in unpaid internships. Men, minority students, transfer students were all less likely to participate. I think some of that maybe is related to the disciplines or the fields they're gravitating towards, but also, again, barriers to participation that are maybe showing up for minority students, transfer students. Again, these paths may be closed to them. Income was also strongly connected. And right away, I started to see the separation, not only in terms of who participates, but also the outcomes. So when you look a little deeper, and I looked just at that very top rating, again, on that 5-point scale, those who completed unpaid internships were 10% less likely to say this was extremely beneficial. So you start to pick apart and see some differences. And mapping those student experiences onto career outcomes data, again, you start to see some differences and some gaps in terms of the outcomes that students experience. So those who did an unpaid internship just prior to graduating were likely to still be seeking employment 6 months out in our career outcomes data, and also likely to have a lower salary outcome, so about $7,000, even when controlling for other things like their college and demographic information. So that kind of provided a foundation to, again, start to see some of the differences and outcomes between the two types of experiences. And the next phase of the study was to collect additional data from students who are, or alumni who were a few years out. So looking at that same period, kind of from 2010 to 2014, I sent a survey to alumni who had completed the career outcomes data. We already had their initial outcomes, and asked them to report on high-impact experiences that they had internships, student organizations, other things they had done on campus, and kind of talk more about those experiences. They were asked to pick 3 to report on, and 100 of those were paid internships, 100 of those were unpaid internships, so strong representation of both. Within that, there was a total of 600 different experiences, 645. And they were asked to rate those experiences in terms of different outcomes drawn from those kind of theoretical concepts. So how did these experiences shape things like goal setting, confirming or rejecting your field of interest, professional skill development, academic performance, what experiences did you have with access to networking, quality of supervision, or your overall success in your job search. And then they were asked about just generally how beneficial were these experiences, and what was your satisfaction level with your first job after college? So these results showed that, again, there were some trends in who participated in unpaid internships. It's probably not surprising that a lot of our College of Journalism students were doing unpaid internships. Those students are going out all the time and kind of creating their own social media internships and things like that. Family and Consumer Sciences, which at UGA is a smattering of different things like consumer economics, human development, fashion merchandising, which may be a source of some of those. And then students in public policy, international affairs, and political science reported engaging really intensely with unpaid internships. So one thing they were asked is, compared to your peers, like how much did you engage with these activities? And again, a lot of those students are working as Dean Hess mentioned, for a legislator or a nonprofit, and they might have a series of unpaid internships throughout their whole time in college. But again, those experiences were correlated with longer timelines to full-time employment after graduation, and being 11% less likely to express satisfaction with their first job after college. So there's this kind of persistent trend that there's some differences in outcomes for those who engage with unpaid work. As I mentioned, students reported a range of different types of experiences, and I'm just going to read off a few from this list of results. But some of the experiences that were related to longer job searches, essentially, were things like working off campus part-time, an unpaid internship, research, and study abroad. And so we'll circle back to this idea because some of these experiences are kind of linked in that they're, an intense level of engagement with some of these more academic kind of experiences may relate to differences in job search outcomes. And the second wave of analysis also showed differences in salary outcomes. So a lower salary level for students who participated in unpaid internships and a higher level of salary outcomes for students who did paid internships, and the combined effect again falls between that range of $6,000 to $7,000 in their initial job search. So some real differences that emerged there. I won't talk a lot about the qualitative component, but I'll just mention this briefly because this helped me kind of contextualize the study and the analysis a little bit more. There are three main themes that came out of the conversations. Basically, I emailed students who had participated both in paid and unpaid work to have conversations with them about kind of comparing the experiences and their choices around those experiences. It was really clear from those conversations that the students were really aware of the discourse around unpaid internships and the issues around access. At UGA, we're very fortunate to have state support through the Hope Scholarship, and a lot of students mentioned that specifically as a reason why they were able to do unpaid work. Money that their parents had saved for college was able to go instead towards supporting them to pursue these types of experiences, to go to DC or to drive a couple hours. And also, that was helpful in uncovering some real kind of gems on our campus in terms of courses or faculty members or mentors who were doing a really great job of supporting students. So a lot of times when they started talking about, their career journey, the conversation began with internships, but then they would talk about how they integrated those experiences in other ways on campus. So I think that part is really important, not to get left out, and maybe something, especially at a big campus, that we could be doing more of to make sure we're aware of kind of those resources that we have right in our front door. But I want to focus on the sort of this cultural dynamic because I think for me this is a really important reminder that kind of the cultural immersion aspect of the internship, whether it's paid or unpaid, is a real value add takeaway for the students. So one of these students, who here I call Sarah, she had started doing unpaid internships, even after high school, and just kind of 1 or 2 month kind of stints over the summer that really helped her understand as she went through college, how to become more targeted in her search in regard to the type of culture she wanted, the sort of company mission that she wanted to tie herself to. She had a lot to say around kind of this sense of fit, even though she wasn't doing like real significant project work, she had some really significant takeaways that subsequently shaped the rest of her experience. I left these texts heavy, knowing that I would send the slides out, but I'll read this one off because it's just highly entertaining. This is a student named Michael, who's one of those political science majors who did go to DC and intern. And when I talked to him, he said, "Well, I'm kind of country, even though I live in downtown Atlanta, which is my own living hell a little bit. But DC, nobody drives up there. Everybody's pretty much broke. Like senior staffers are barely making their rent. It's all this big flurry of anger, and then everybody goes to happy hour and then drinks it all off. Whereas like in state politics, we get a phone call about a busted water main in some city I've never seen, and then the next day's news, we see that it's fixed." And as an alum, he was working in the state capitol now. That's a really quick example, but it's things like that where you see stuff happening. DC, I was up there for a month and a half, and I didn't see one bill get voted on except the Veterans Care Act, which was unanimous, and it just seemed like everybody was yelling the whole time. This was in 2015, so I can only imagine what it's like now. I mean, it's definitely fun, but I knew I could do Atlanta. I wasn't going to go up there and slum it out. If I was on a campaign that won its way to D.C., I would love to go up there, but I'm not going to go job hunting in Washington. The day I got back, I was like, I'm knowing what I'm doing before I ever considered going up there again. But without an internship, I probably would have just packed up the truck and moved to D.C. So I think that's a really powerful story. And he was doing an unpaid internship with our senator, I believe. And obviously there's some major access issues around that experience. But obviously there's some big takeaways that he gained through that experience. And I think that's something we have to kind of wrestle with, how we can support more students having these types of opportunities to get these experiences that he had. So some of the discussion points, this is one of the most important kind of takeaways from the study itself, which is this visualization of what are the differences between paid and unpaid opportunities. And I mentioned these different outcomes that we ask students about, professional skill development, job search success, networking supervision. When I kind of mapped out what students reported gaining from their different experiences, there were significant areas of overlap in both paid and unpaid work. Many students talked about how those things helped them confirm or reject a career interest, set or attain goals. They had positive experiences in both areas with supervisors and networking. But then there were areas where you started to see separation. So the paid experiences were much more significantly linked to professional skill development and job search success. So really helping them make that transition from college to work. And the unpaid internships were more significantly linked to understanding their academic coursework. So it was a little bit more of a theory to practice thing going on with the unpaid internships. I went back after this and looked at the research literature, and this is a kind of framework from Kolb, David Kolb. He talks about the phases students move through, starting with the concrete experience, and then they go reflect on that, and there's some abstract thinking that occurs, and then they extend it by another phase of experimenting. And this is kind of this iterative process, the way he conceptualizes it. But when I thought further about this, I really thought that you could situate, based on this information, unpaid and paid internships at these distinct points in the process, right? So the things that students were saying about unpaid internships were often more about this concrete experience. Like, I'm there, I'm getting a feel for the place, I'm kind of seeing how the people talk. In many cases, the unpaid internships seemed to be more like extended job shadowing type experiences, right? Students were maybe less likely to have like a really significant work project or things like that. And the paid internships, Kolb talks about extension, this extension phase being the active manipulation of the external world. As Matt was saying, many paid internships are becoming more and more competitive, and students are working on really significant projects in some of those opportunities. And tends to be more of this higher level of expectation for work output and active, extension of your skill sets. So for me, I summed up the findings for this study. Again, the data was focused specifically on our campus, and so I was thinking, how could we map this information back onto campus-level policy? One is thinking about, as Dean Hess mentioned, particular colleges and particular types of students that are more likely to do unpaid internships, and how can we interrupt that cycle a little bit, or how can we provide higher levels of support either through institutional resources or connecting more strongly with employers. So for us, that was the College of Journalism, as I mentioned, Family Consumer Sciences, Public Policy. We need to focus more institutional strategy specifically in those areas. And I mentioned outcomes, barriers to access for minority students. Another thing that showed up in our models was that transfer students at our institution across the board tended to report less gains in those areas across their internship experiences. And so demographically, there's certain groups that need further support. And so that's another way we could approach that as an institution. And then finally, again, I mentioned my background being in career services. How can we support students navigating the risks of this kind of paid and unpaid landscape. What advising strategies can we employ to really help them vet certain processes to make sure that they understand how to evaluate, how to find opportunities that fit their needs, how to find resources. There's a whole kind of conversation we could have around that one-on-one advising conversation.
In one of your slides, you talked about the injustice of unpaid internships. And some of our students have said it's like a double injustice because they're getting unpaid and they're paying for college credit at the same time. Yeah. And experiencing great frustration with that and then deciding, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to go down that road, pay for tuition, and have to do an unpaid internship.
Yeah.
What can we do about those kinds of issues?
Initially, when this issue sort of surfaced or got more attention, that was like one of the solutions, right? And really, who's that for? In my mind, in many cases, that's really a CYA thing for the employer, right? To incentivize them to de-risk, hosting an intern, kind of thing. So it's a major injustice, and I think maybe we should try to flip that problem as much as we can and think about other strategies. So can we do things like curating more internship-like experiences on our campus? A lot of part-time jobs on campus can really be internships. Can we do co-location, bringing more employers to us to make it more accessible for students to do those things? I was just at the University of Arkansas, and they have I don't know if you ever see the J.B. Hunt trucks driving around. Their office is about an hour away from U of A, but they have a co-located intern facility right there on campus, and they're hiring like 20 or 30 students a semester. So, I think we need to be more creative in our approach because we're hitting same thing with graduate students that I'm experiencing now. It's a double whammy.
I'm Susan Stafford. I'm from Houston, Texas. I teach at the University of Houston, Cizik School of Nursing. I teach leadership and business. I was interested in your fact that you talked about the paid internships make about $7,000 more a year in their salary, their first salary going out. I'm wondering if there is some unintentional bias there. It's been my experience, and I'm interested in your experience, that when industry, and in my case it'd be hospital, healthcare, take on an intern, they're really looking for someone to hire. So is there that we're going to bring this person on, it's kind of like the pre-employment trial phase, and they've invested the money and the time in this person, and so they want to keep the person. So there's some competitive salary issues there. In my organization, we have what we call fellowships. And so obviously all of our staff are already registered nurses. In the doctorate level, they're all typically in leadership, mid to high leadership positions. And what we have found is that they actually change jobs, sometimes in that fellowship, because of the opportunity. So I'm just interested in your perspective on that salary. That's a pretty good chunk of change as far as, salary goes.
Paid internships are, a path to employment and a recruiting strategy. And the other thing is, if a company, and again, this goes back to like an advising conversation. I would say this to students all the time. If a company is willing to pay you, they're going to invest, not that this won't happen in an unpaid internship, but for sure if they're paying you, they're going to be thinking about how can they make good use of your time, how can they make it a productive experience for you and for them. And so I think there's more likelihood to be significant project work that also, you turn that around and it becomes more marketable when you're on the job market. And so I think, at least at our campus, my observation is that a lot of the unpaid things students are doing are really project-based. Maybe it's social media for a local startup or kind of extensive job shadowing type things that maybe don't equate to as much marketability as like a paid corporate internship, for example.
Hi, I'm Sarah Ring from the University of Northwestern St. Paul. With the unpaid and paid, we're trying to track right now, like we've created a couple of scholarships for students. So if they're getting a scholarship or a grant, or do you count that as paid? Do you count it as unpaid? How do you track? Or also if they have a stipend, maybe they just get $500 a semester. How do you measure that?
So they were just asked, is it paid or unpaid? But that's a tricky question for sure. I had that. I interned for the Park Service when I was in college, and it was unpaid, but then I got a stipend at the end. So what do you call that?
My question is for you, Andrew. It's about funding, and if you can't answer this, if there's a lawyer in the group. So I'm inquiring about work-study funding for internships. So I know that you can use work-study funds in the local community, nonprofit sector to pay interns. My question is, if the school does not support work-study funds for that specifically as a process, is it possible for a student who has work-study funding to come in and say, okay, I want or need to do an internship? Is it possible to say to that student, you can use your work-study funds and place them in that internship position without needing to have a piece of that work-study funding pie specifically targeted to the internship program? So for anybody, so service learning might have a chunk of change from the work-study pot, the campus work-study pot. And then, of course, campus positions have the vast majority of those work-study funds. If the internship program does not have a piece of that pie, could we simply just let students use their work-study funds to work off campus as long as it's in a nonprofit in the local community, which is legal? I just don't know if it has to be part of the pot or if I can just say yes.
I'm Chris Pierre. I'm the Director of Career Development and Community Partnerships at Northeastern Illinois University. I've been looking into this, and I can tell you there's some things you can do with that, and some of it's going to depend on what kind of an institution you work at. In most cases, work study is going to provide for community work study funds, which is the formal definition. There is, at most institutions, there's a requirement of some type of a match from the off-campus nonprofit. I want to say it's something in the 25-30% range, so that, let's say if the YWCA of Madison wanted to have a community work study student work there as an intern, they'd have to toss in 25-30%, whatever, of that. There are some differences with minority-serving institutions, and I know this because Northeastern is a minority-serving institution, but I'll be candid, I'm having disputes with our financial aid staff on that. When I look at the federal definitions, it said for minority-serving institutions, there is not the requirement of a match for nonprofits, but that's a whole thing. There is also new experimental legislation going on for, and I don't have all the details on this, that is going to allow some use of work study funds to support work in for-profit industries. But that is something it's a special process, and I don't know the details on that. But that's you can't just use it anywhere. There has to be some matches that go on.
I'm Jean from the Career Center at UW-Milwaukee. I actually have two questions. I know. Okay, so first question is, the screen that you showed, Andrew, that spoke to people who have, and I don't know if we heard incorrectly here, so I want to confirm if we heard correctly. There was a screen that you said at the 6-month point, people who had unpaid internships, and then you also highlighted research and study abroad. You actually suggested that those people have a harder time, or it takes them longer to find positions. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was just linked to a longer job search. And that's if students, the question they were asked in the survey is, did you engage really intensely in these activities? The kind of theme that connects all those is they're kind of exploratory type things that students are doing, that maybe that's the reason.
When you're doing this, are we speaking about solely what you explained as an internship, or are you including things like clinical placements, student teaching, and that sort of thing when you're talking about it as unpaid?
And we don't have as many clinical programs. I think I included co-ops in the list, but it was mostly internship and co-ops.
I study college graduates who are underemployed, so working in a job that does not require a degree after graduation. And in one of my recent projects, study abroad is disproportionately represented. So people who studied abroad seem to be more likely to be underemployed. And I was just curious what you make of that, kind of following up on the other question of study abroad, I think has similar concerns to internships around who has access, is it this extra cost students are taking on? So I don't have an answer, but just curious from your research if you have any insights on that.
In other studies that I've seen that pop up, and I haven't ever specifically focused on study abroad, but there's some connection there, and I'm happy to have like a conversation offline because I have a colleague who does study abroad stuff specifically that she and I have had some initial discussions about that, but I think it's an interesting thing to explore.
I was wondering if you could expand a bit on this experiment that you have on your campus of internships being co-located on campus, so companies hiring students that then work on campus, and what your impression or experience or opinion is about the quote-unquote quality of these internships compared to an internship done at a work site, where possibly I would argue that if it's done on campus, you lose part of the experience, this cultural experience that a lot of students were pointing at in terms of understanding how professionals communicate and what kind of projects they work on, how they tackle projects, and so on. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that is structured, if it's structured in a way that preserves that component. And I had a second question that concerned the paid internship. Do you have evidence that paid internship are actually structured in a way where students are, where the experience is designed to have meaningful work for the students, both for the student and for the company? In my experience, that is not always the case.
Your first question is really good, and UGA is just now starting to enter that space a little bit more and doing some kind of development around industry, kind of co-location on campus. So the example that I gave, the University of Arkansas, is a really good one. That there's about an hour distance between the main corporate office and that sort of outpost. They have full-time staff there. They have relevant team meetings there periodically, so the students get to interact with those people. The facility's branded, and sort of the work is structured identically to how it would be. So they've done a really good job, and they were careful to really promote that as a benefit, that you're still getting the corporate experience with, the ability to skateboard to your job. So I think, colleges could be really strategic around asking those questions for employers who want to do that, because it could be, we're an hour from Atlanta. It could be someone driving over once a week to have like a meeting in the student union with students, which would not be those things, or it could be very strategically designed to replicate that. And I think if again the company's goal is talent acquisition at the end of the day, then it would be in their best interest to replicate that to the greatest extent possible, right? I'm trying to remember what the second question was. Yeah. Yeah, definitely not. I mean, I think a lot about coaching conversations with students, and it's much easier with older students. So I think in an ideal world, younger students would be empowered to go and experiment and maybe, do some unpaid things that would allow them to confirm, yes, this is something I want to pursue further. And then older students, we really need to coach them through to be able to ask good questions. How am I going to spend my time with your company? How am I going to be evaluated? Spending a lot of time helping them navigate that process so they can evaluate opportunities. And I think students are really starting to tune into the fact, many students are tuning into the fact that this experience is really pivotal for kind of launching your career. And so they want to be mindful of choosing the right one.
I have a question, I guess, following up on the theme of paid and unpaid internships. I was wondering if in your study, or if you know of other studies that have separated out what majors the students are in, as well as what careers they're going into, because some careers tend to pay more than other careers, and also some majors tend to go, are more qualified for certain kinds of careers than other type of careers.
I haven't revisited the literature in the past year or so, but at the time, there was one study from Intern Bridge that kind of delved into that issue. And then there are a lot of studies that were focused in specific disciplines. And so there's a real lack of like comparative research on this topic. And I'm also curious to know if many other schools have good data on what their students are doing in terms of internships. And even ours, we have fairly good data, but it's self-reported. Students who are having bad experiences maybe aren't reporting as much. So I think there's maybe a data gap, and there's definitely a gap in the literature in terms of the studies are very narrow that I observed when I started looking around at the literature. If they address compensation at all, which many just talk about internships.
All of our students are graduate students. Many of them are in unpaid internships, just as kind of a function of education, and many of the partner organizations in the area we worked with. One of the things we found, and not quantitatively measured or anything, but it's that the students doing the unpaid internships often have a leg up, so to speak, in negotiating the scope of the work that they're doing.
Yep.
And has that been something that you found in your experience at Georgia?
So the question is, does doing unpaid work kind of serve as a bargaining chip? I mean, I think it can if the student knows how to do that. I would argue that a lot of the students probably, graduate students maybe more so, but that's a good question. I didn't note anything specific to that, but I think that's one of the conversations that happens. I think if you're working with a student who's looking at doing something unpaid is just like going through those NACE guidelines with them. When is the work going to start? When is it going to end? What is the structure of your work going to be? And kind of helping them, because a lot of times they're working for organizations that don't have a real strong infrastructure anyway. And so there's coaching on both the student and the employer part as to how to structure that experience. And because they're co-creating it, I think there's a lot more opportunity for students to do that. But yeah, that's another ripe area for probably more research, I would think.